Thank you, Hillary. I think singing songs like that is really important, and there's a reason for that. By the way, children of the 90s, that was for you. I think that religion has, for eons, made this separation between what's holy and what's profane, and religion has sort of called the world profane, but when we sing songs that we might hear on the radio during the week, the hope is that it's a reminder that the holy is everywhere, that we can experience the holy even in Phoenix traffic. It's possible. Well, we're all saints. When I was a kid, it seemed like so much work to have a garden. Hard segue, but here we go. Some years when I was a kid, my grandparents and my parents would plant seeds of corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and onions and potatoes, these enormous backyard gardens, and our backyards were acres back then. First they had to burn off the weeds, or they chose to burn off the weeds, and the remnants of last year's vegetable plants, and then they used a rototiller to turn the char and the fertilizer into the soil. And then after the rows were all lined up, the kids and adults together got on our knees and pushed the seeds into the waiting soil. For a kid, the end of planting day was the most infuriating part. You spend half a day planting seeds, shoving dirt around, sweating in the Indiana humidity, fussing with each other because everybody's hot and tired and thinking about leaving the family as soon as this is over. You do all that only to walk away and, on looking back to admire your work, see that nothing had changed. Nothing. It looked just like it did when we got there. It was hard to believe that this invisible corn would be as high as an elephant's eye by the 4th of July. Still, what could we do but wait? So week after week, my brothers and I would examine the soil like budding scientists, pointing at any disturbance that looked like a shoot as evidence that whatever magical process made plants grow really was at work just under the surface, until finally tiny leaves and shoots really did poke through the dirt. It was as close to a miracle as anything I had ever seen, still is. At the end of those summers, our tables would be filled with the most delicious, misshapen tomatoes. They're always the best, the round ones, and gorgeous yellow corn, and we would often have so much that my mother and my grandmothers would can tomatoes and pickles, green beans and relish for the winter. In my middle age, this gardening looks to me like rebellion against a society that wanted us to buy more and more and more. My folks knew that they could rely on something greater than the spirit of the market to take care of them. I couldn't have imagined being in the awful fix of the woman whose story is recounted in the section of the Hebrew Bible called the Nevi'im in the book of 1 Kings. There was a terrible drought and famine in the land, and to protect the prophet Elijah, God tells Elijah to go live by this little creek. There he could drink from the creek's water, and birds would bring him food to eat. But there was no rain, and eventually the creek dried up. So God told Elijah to go into a nearby town where there would be a widow who would take care of him. Now, being a widow in this patriarchal culture meant that you had to rely on your own cunning and the goodness of your neighbors for just about everything you needed. Saying someone was a widow was usually the same thing as saying they were living in poverty. So Elijah walks into town in the middle of the most severe famine anyone had ever experienced. Immediately he sees the widow gathering sticks, and he says to her, "Please bring me a jar of water to drink. Also, I'm hungry. Please bring me a loaf of bread to eat." I'm working on forgiving Elijah for this intrusion. The woman's response is heartbreaking. She says, "Please, I don't have much. I have a handful of flour and a little bit of olive oil left at the bottom of a jug. I was gathering sticks so that I could head home to bake one last loaf of bread for me and my son so that we can eat it and then die. And Elijah answers her, "Go ahead and make the bread and bring it to me. And I promise you that the flour will never run out and there will always be oil in the bottom of the jug." And here's how the author records what happens next. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. There are a couple things that intrigue me about the way this story ends. First, there's an implication later in the chapter that she didn't really believe Elijah was really a true prophet just because of the oil and flour. Later in the chapter, he performs this shocking miracle, and she says, "Oh, now I see that you're a prophet." So, stretching out the story a bit, if the bottomless flour and oil didn't convince her, then what really happened? Well, second, the story doesn't say at all how the miracle happened. It doesn't talk about the mechanics of the thing. Did she scoop out the last of it every time only to go back for the next meal and find there was more? What did that look like? Now, I don't think this story is newspaper true. So, like ancient rabbis who sometimes added to stories in a practice called midrash, I want to imagine what might have happened. From what I've seen, flour and oil don't replace themselves. This is one weird universe, and I don't discount much as completely impossible. But I'd say something else is more likely. If I were writing this story, I would write what I know. I know from my limited experience with gardening that there is something at work in the world that will give us everything we need if we're careful to tend and nurture it. This life force is something that we mostly understand around the edges, but we don't completely control it, certainly. And the big question of why it should exist in the first place, we haven't really answered with all our poking and prodding of the universe. So I know there are forces beyond my control which tend to take care of us if we take care of them. I also know that there are times when that force seems to lie dormant, when we can't count on getting along, just us and that invisible life force. Or maybe it's better, there are times when that life force acts through other people. When Heather and I had just had our first child, who's now 17 years old somehow, then she was small enough for me to hold her in one arm. We were pretty poor. I was serving a tiny little Nazarene church in a microscopic town in Indiana, and we just didn't have enough to make ends meet. We relied on government assistance to feed our baby. Because other people paid their taxes, we could keep our baby healthy and happy and, frankly, alive. In the State of the Union speech, the president bragged about having kicked millions of people off of that assistance. But the way I see it, government assistance has been one way the life force has acted in my own experience. Call it God, call it what you will. Like an enfleshment of that old stone soup story where everybody brings what they have and together they make a soup that feeds the whole village. One more story. We were just coming out of that time of struggle, moving to a larger congregation that paid better, but we still were digging out. I got a call from a pastor in another congregation who asked me to come preach at their little church way out in the country. And after that service, they surprised us with a whole trunk full of food and baby supplies and a love offering to get us through. The way I see it, their generosity was a product of that same force that pushes those little seeds through the dirt. I've heard preachers talk about being absolutely certain of things that they're not absolutely certain of. But I stand before you truly, completely convinced that we can rely on goodness itself, which some call God, maybe especially when that goodness acts through our neighbors and even social service agencies that we all work together to fund, if we're careful to tend it, to keep our hearts in line with it. Life itself, love itself, will provide our needs. So I think of that widow and her son, destitute and near death, but willing to share what they had. I can't imagine the pain she felt as she mixed the bread, the oil, and the water for what she truly believed would be her and her son's last meal. But I'll bet either she or that wily old prophet went and told the neighbors about her situation. Now, none of them had much more than the widow did, but one by one they dropped in and poured their oil and flour into her containers. And suddenly the widow had enough not just for herself, her son, and the prophet, but for everybody in the village. So she got to baking. And as she baked, people hung around, chatting and waiting for food. Her kitchen became the ancient version of a community organizer's headquarters. People talked about their shared problems, especially the terrible drought and where there might be enough to get them through. And over shared meals, they became a community, sustained by the force of life and love acting through them. They survived long enough to see rain again, to watch grain stretch toward the sky again, to gather it in and fill every barrel in the village, because they were generous when they felt they barely had enough for themselves, starting with that one destitute woman. We can rely on life to sustain us if we keep our hearts turned that way. These are not the easiest times to do that, I don't think. No matter your politics, we're just about as deeply polarized as we've ever been. I'm afraid we're suspicious of our neighbors no matter what political party we're part of. Everybody wants to win, and to win, it seems a lot of people think they have to obliterate their opponents. But that only cements people in their positions. I'm trying to be better about that myself. It's not always easy. But the truth is, we're all in this together. We all have to rely on that invisible spirit of life and love to sustain us in ways we can't sustain ourselves. And we can all be channels of that for our neighbors who are in need. We can each change the tone on our streets, then in our neighborhoods. One conversation, one casserole or pan of brownies or baby shower at a time. Small acts make an incredible difference. I want to invite Barbara Face, who's a member of this congregation, to tell us a story about that.
Good morning. My father was not a warm and fuzzy fellow. Loving with family, absolutely. Friendly with poker pals, oh yeah. But he was very particular about the people with whom he spent time. It couldn't be just anybody. Some said he was a man's man. As he aged, the golf and poker outings dwindled. He became isolated. I told him about the weekly bridge game at the Chandler Senior Center, which I thought might help with his isolation. After a few months, he caved and consented to check it out. Turns out he liked it and allowed me to take him every Friday, but only for the bridge game, not for lunch in the noisy cafeteria with overly friendly seniors. Once, I asked him if he was looking forward to chatting with his friends. "Oh," he said, "bridge is a serious game. It's not about socializing." After my mother died, we had to move him to a new residential care home, which was owned by a young Filipino man. Not really my dad's kind of guy. To our surprise, he quickly settled in and soon began telling stories about Edgar's toddler daughter. On Valentine's Day, I was dispatched to Walgreens with a carefully clipped coupon from the newspaper to buy her a little stuffed bear. Over time, I realized why the connection worked. Edgar loved my dad, and not for any other reason than that's who Edgar is. He used touch to let my dad know that he was there for him. A light brush on the shoulder, or a casual hand on his head as he walked by. I saw my dad relax and lean into those touches with trust and the awareness that he was not alone.
Small acts make a tremendous difference. They are in their way revolutionary. A touch or a look of kindness, inclusion, when it's obvious someone wants to be included. We're being invited, of course, to divide ourselves only along political party lines. But even in a presidential election year, babies are born. People get married. Some people die too young, and other families lose their matriarch. We buy groceries and try our best to get plants to grow and love our kids and our pets. Both Republicans and Democrats and independents, even as far as I know, live and love and grieve and pass away. I believe that generosity, tapping into the ever-present spirit of life and sharing it, can change things. What do you have to share? Love? A passing, comforting touch? A note or a recipe? Food for a family that's struggling? A conversation, some time? We can all be generous somehow because we're all recipients of generosity. May we be strong enough to be generous, even in times like these. Amen.